Greetings, Zimbabwe, Africa, and the world. Welcome to In Conversation with Trevor, brought to you by Titan Law. I go beyond the headlines and beyond the sensational. Today, I'm in conversation with the EU Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Ambassador Timo Olkkonen. Ambassador Timo Olkkonen, welcome to In Conversation with Trevor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You've been in place now for over a year. What's been the experience like?
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. Zimbabwe is a wonderful country. We had previous African experience and it was easy to settle in. People have been extremely friendly, welcoming. I have a great staff at the delegation, at the EU delegation. So coming in both professionally and from a personal, from a family life perspective has been easy. All the basic blocks of everyday life have been settling in nicely, and what I've seen from the country, it's wonderful, and the people have been, like I said, very welcoming. Professionally, things have been different from what I've expected. When I was preparing for the job, the expectations were a little bit different, and I was hoping that we would be, and my expectations were that we would talk more about economic cooperation, private sector links, and so forth. But the job has been more political than I would have expected, so the trend a little bit and what has been happening in the country over the year has been somewhat more challenging from that perspective than I would have expected.
Roller coaster, more challenging. Do you want to unpack that? What does that mean?
Well, like I said, when I was coming into the country, and it was there was a build-up and the run-up to the elections last year, July. And there was a lot of optimism and goodwill. The pre-electoral campaign had went quite well, and there was a lot of expectations that Zimbabwe would be taking off. Then we had the August 1st events. That was before I came to the country. So there's a little bit, okay, let's see, how this is handled and how the country moves forward. And then there was the January events, which were a big disappointment, I think, for the international community of what had transpired in January, and then ensuing issues after that on the political front. And obviously on the economic side, Zimbabwe has experienced a fair share of difficulties, and then you have the humanitarian situation, which is quite dire, has become worse over the past year. So professionally, what I've meant that it's been a lot of events have happened. There's never been a boring moment. It has been quite challenging, professionally extremely interesting, but emotionally a little bit of a roller coaster.
Have any of the postings that you've had before? I mean, you've spent a lot of time in Brussels, and you've been to Kenya, Zambia, Malawi. Have any of those experiences prepared you for what you are facing in Zimbabwe right now?
I think so. From a professional experience, in my own service, I have the reputation of having the Africa stamp in my forehead. So wherever I've been working for the past around 20 years or so, I've always dealt with issues related to Africa or development aid, also in Brussels, also in Finland, and indeed, obviously during my stays in Kenya and Zambia. Of course, it's a big advantage if you have experience from the region. And we've gone through some historical moments previously in my career. The 2002 elections in Kenya were a really big thing. And we had 2 elections also in Zambia during my tenure. So it has helped, and obviously, but Zimbabwe is a very special country. You can't lump countries together and say that it's all the same. Not at all. Zimbabwe has specific challenges.
Explain that to us. Zimbabwe is a special country. What does that mean?
Well, starting from the terms that even the independence was reached only in 1980. And you had quite a traumatic history before that with the independence war, with Rhodesia, all the international issues around it. Then you have had very traumatic experiences even post-independence. And indeed, for the past 20 years or so, a troubled relationship with the international community and with the EU especially. So you come in a situation where there's a lot of history in the setup that you're entering, and you have to be conscious about that. And there's a lot of, I'm afraid to say, but also antagonism, also vis-a-vis, and what I would call misunderstandings that I haven't experienced previously in my career. So it is...
Who is responsible for this misunderstanding? Is it the West? Is it the Zimbabweans? Who's responsible for that?
Well, I'd say it's partly deliberate.
On which side?
From the side of from the people that have vested interests in keeping the system as it is at the moment. I think it comes from there of fueling misconceptions about what the West or the EU especially want from Zimbabwe. I was telling about neo-colonialism, wanting Zimbabwe to fail, issues around, accusing me also personally about racism, which I find, completely unacceptable. So I think there's a tendency of, and it's particularly vocal in the social media, which is of course a very difficult environment to control. But it's also a product of our tense relations and our history. For example, this whole debate about quote-unquote sanctions is a major part of that debate and how that is perceived. So there's
we'll get to sanctions later on. I read in between the lines that for you, the low moments have been the August shootings and the January, the handling of the January protests. Have there been any highlights, memorable, positive events that have struck you?
I think there has been, moments of achievement. I think that when we had the relaunch of the formal political dialogue with Zimbabwe, and I think that the first discussion went very well. Recently, early October, we had the launch of the broadening of our free trade agreement to cover other areas such as services, competition, procurement, so forth. That was a positive. I can't take much credit of that because we had our trade specialists working on that, but I think it was very a positive event. So yes, there are some uplifting moments as well.
It's good to hear. You've been very outspoken on the need for political reforms. Do you want to unpack to us your frustrations and whether you think you've made any progress for your call for political reforms?
Well, the progress has been slower than we would have wanted or expected. If you read the Transitional Stabilization Program, it's basically saying about constitutional alignment, bringing the laws in tune with the Constitution, that process should have been done within 12 months. Now, 12 months have passed, and we haven't seen very many finished products in terms of new legislation yet. And partly, we have a particular interest in this because the EU is also financially supporting that progress. So even the maintenance of public...
So you're funding the alignment of the laws to the Constitution?
We are funding technical assistance to the Attorney General's office and to the Ministry of Justice.
How much is that? How much is that?
It's to the tune of around 2 million. Or
okay.
So, yeah.
What's your biggest frustration there?
Well, I would say the overall process has been frustrating, but it's also the fact that there's some totemic pieces of legislation, such as the POSA, and the IPA Act that many people were regarding somehow as symbolic. For us, they are not a specific trigger as such, but I know that many people were focusing on those, and we still haven't seen those.
What is a trigger for you? What would be the trigger for you?
We don't have a trigger as such, for anything specific. I know there's some expectations from the government side that what they are hoping that the EU, our member states, and the international community in general would do. But what we particularly want to see is that the government's own reform program, what the government itself has committed itself to do, would move forward. And there has not been a lot of traction, not enough traction.
So it's basically what the government has promised to do, which they are not doing, which you're frustrated about.
In a nutshell, yes. That we would see Zimbabwe moving forward with a faster speed if it would tackle political reforms and indeed structural economic reforms. But in addition, we have these human rights issues that have come up, especially since January, which are troublesome.
Let's go a bit backwards and look at the Zimbabwe-EU relationship, which is predicated on the ACP-EU Partnership Agreement, the Cotonou Agreement. What are the main pillars of that partnership?
Well, that partnership is first of all, there's political cooperation, which is then enshrined in the political dialogue, particularly, but involves other areas. So it's about a dialogue about human rights, about democratization, about good governance. There's a financial pillar, which is particularly related to development cooperation, but increasingly on also private sector support instruments. And then what used to be very important under the Cotonou pillar was the trade cooperation, which has then been completely renewed because of WTO requirements. And like I said, we have now a free trade agreement that is separate from the Cotonou setup, but kind of like a follow-up to what we had in Cotonou.
What would you say are the main benefits of being a member of that relationship?
Well, it's an international relationship that we have 79 African, Caribbean, Pacific states. And then we have the 28 EU member states and the EU institutions. It has proven a very important tool to foster mutual understanding, to provide a forum where you discuss very pertinent issues within the national context through the national political dialogues that we have had bilaterally with these African, Caribbean, Pacific states, and then together in the global fora where important issues such as climate change have been discussed. Very often people have really been concentrating only on the financial side, on the development cooperation side, and I think it's a bit unfair. It has much more to it.
Let's move on to the February 2002, which I think is an important date, because that I think represented the fracture of the relationship between Zimbabwe and the EU, when the Council for the European Union decided that Zimbabwe had breached human rights issues, violations of human rights, freedom of opinion, association and assembly. And we came up with these restrictive measures. Unpack to us what those restrictive measures were all about.
Well, the restrictive measures consisted of basically three elements. There was an arms embargo. There still is an arms embargo. So basically a prohibition for European companies to export armaments to Zimbabwe. And then there were restrictive measures on a number of individuals and entities, basically companies, which then...
Can I ask you to name the individuals and the entities?
At the moment, we have only 2 persons on the active lists of restrictive measures, which are the former presidential couple. Robert Mugabe is still there, and Grace Mugabe. Then we have a suspended list. So we have 3 persons there, which is Valerio Zibanda and Vice President Chiwenga and Minister of Lands Prince Shiri, who are on the suspended list, which means that yes, the list is still there, but there's no active measures taken on them. And then on the
so just for clarity, it's Minister Perence Shiri is on the suspended list.
That's right.
Vice President Chiwenga is on the list. And who else?
Valerio Zibanda,
that's the army commander.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then on the entities list, we have the Zimbabwe Defense Industries. This is a big reduction of how wide the list used to be earlier. So it's very, very restricted in its number at the moment. So what it means for the individuals is that there's an asset freeze for their assets in Europe, in the European Union, and a travel ban for them to travel into the EU. As this one company is concerned, still, it means that there's a prohibition of European companies to cooperate with the company.
What are the prospects of the 3 individuals being removed from the suspended list, or the list being increased?
Well, I cannot predict that, because that's a decision that is taken within the Council of the European Union unanimously by the European Union member states. But clearly, what is of interest to the EU and the member states is what's happening on the ground. What is particularly, because the human rights situation was at the origin of the restrictive measures, so clearly it's the human rights situation which is elemental when we are looking at what's going to happen with the restrictive measures in the future. There's an annual review, so it's a decision that needs to be taken within the EU.
I ask this seeing as the Americans have added Owen Ncube to their list. Is that a cue for you guys to relook your list, either to reduce or to increase?
I really wouldn't be able to comment on that. It's something that is, will go through its due process and will be decided then within this framework.
Okay. You have what you call appropriate measures, which have been in effect, which were rather in effect from 2002 to 2014. Again, what does that mean? Appropriate measures. What do they look like?
Appropriate measures mean that you are not, from the EU side, we are not at liberty at cooperating directly with the government through the means of development cooperation.
Okay.
So indeed, we had these appropriate measures in place. They were then discontinued in 2014. But what that meant was that our cooperation then were channeled without consulting and without working with the government. Since 2014 onwards, we have what we call the National Indicative Program, which is agreed with the government. So this is basically in a nutshell what it meant.
How would you characterize the relationship between the EU and Zimbabwe? Would you say it's a normal relationship? It's a near normal relationship? You're estranged? How would you characterize the relationship?
It's hard to put it in one word. It's on the other hand, we have very positive movement on certain parts of our relationship, such as in our trade agreements and arrangements. Like I said, we have quite a substantial aid program, support program in Zimbabwe. Occasionally in the implementation of the program, we might not always see eye to eye and see when we might have need to iron out some of the differences of how we implement that. But overall, that has been proceeding quite well. But on the political side, we have to admit that there are tensions. We have had, this big campaign about on sanctions and their removal, and we indeed have been stressing the fact that these are, especially in their current state, so limited that they don't have any economic influence on the country. But we hear claims, all kind of claims, also in the public media, about our hidden motives and what we want to do with the country, which are something that we need to tackle and try to clarify our point and where we are coming from. I have to say we have a good working relationship with the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And indeed, the Zimbabwean embassy in Brussels has a good working relationship with with our headquarters. So, so it's very difficult to answer your question with one word.
Why do you think you have a good relationship with Foreign Affairs and not anybody else?
I think it's. Oh, do you mean other authorities?
Yes, other departments.
No, I wasn't saying that.
Okay,
you know,
right.
it's not but you know, Foreign Affairs is our primary interlocutor.
Sure.
As a diplomatic mission, it's a given that Foreign Affairs is our first point of call. But we have cooperation with other ministries, particularly in the areas where we are working in development cooperation: the Ministry of Lands and Agriculture, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Health. And also other interlocutors. We have cooperation with the National Prosecutor's Office. We have good, you know, great discussions with the Anti-Corruption Commission, for example. So, but you know, if you want to test the temperature of where we are, EU-Zimbabwe, then I think, you know, with a practical arrangement with the Foreign Affairs is extremely important.
You confirmed to me that you don't have any trade sanctions against Zimbabwe. You don't. Then is it a matter of principle that you haven't imposed sanctions? Because I asked that question because of the disjuncture between your very loud position that you've taken vis-a-vis the American sanctions against Zimbabwe, and if you juxtapose that with the fact that you don't have trade sanctions against Zimbabwe, one begins to wonder what is causing your very strong position on American sanctions when you as EU don't have trade sanctions against Zimbabwe. Are you hiding behind the Americans?
No. It's our strong position and why we have been also coming out in the public about these quote-unquote sanctions is that we, just as the Americans, were also like framed as we would be responsible for the economic situation where Zimbabwe finds itself in, and even the humanitarian situation, and that was unacceptable, you know, because that's we haven't seen any proof for that, and that's why we needed to go out in the public, and go against that narrative, which we perceive as completely false. It's not about our measures. I would not say that it's about any other measures either, but it's about years and years of mismanagement in the country and the corruption that has been, undermining the economic performance of the country. So why we went out in the open was to counter that narrative, which we saw that was hurting our interests and could have been hurting our relations with Zimbabwe and the Zimbabweans, if they would have thought that the European Union is the cause of our problems. So I would not be able to accept that kind of a proposition.
There was created an impression that you, meaning the EU, the EU ambassadors, had decided to gang up in a very organized manner against the Zimbabwean government and its call for the anti-sanctions march. Is that an appropriate reading of what happened?
No.
It was coincidence that
well, it was when we saw these, like SADC coming up with this resolution, which is also referring to economic issues, and there was no differentiation about whose measures they were talking about, and then we saw this build-up, TV ads, video clips, cartoons, all these kind of things that we have to. So clearly it was like, okay, what's happening now? And also, I have to say, at the headquarters, people were raising their eyebrows. What is this now about? So it was not a question of ganging up, but clearly we all recognized that something was now cooking, something was happening, and then it was like, if we let this go just through like this, people will have their complete wrong understanding about what our measures would be about, and it needed a counter reaction. And I was like, I completely agree. Also, how I find it completely appropriate how the U.S. also reacted to that. I think they were even more on the limelight, and I agree with what my esteemed colleagues said in this very program.
So you believe against there's a strong groundswell. I suppose maybe the right way to say is there's a school of thought that says sanctions are not hurting the majority of the people. American sanctions, they're hitting the targeted people. There's a school of thought that says sanctions are hitting everybody. Where do you stand?
I haven't seen any evidence to that effect of explaining exactly how they would be hurting, particularly the EU restrictive measures, which I said is very limited, how they would be hurting the ordinary people. What I'm hearing is that, it's tarnishing Zimbabwe's reputation. But I think there's many other issues, influencing Zimbabwe's reputation that, if there would be restrictive measures from the EU or not. I was once challenged by a foreign ministry official saying that Google up Zimbabwe and see that sanctions is the first thing that comes through. It was not the sanctions that came through, it was the independent news that day on the 10 million that was claimed to be stolen from the Chinese. That was the first hit, not EU restrictive measures. So yes, I would contest that argument, and I've been also saying in our discussions with relevant people that please show us what is the mechanism, how would this be working. We also been said that it will be hurting investments. Now I've heard it from myself, would it be European investors, and I heard it from my European member states colleagues said that European investors are not concerned about quote-unquote sanctions. They would be happy to come to Zimbabwe if if the environment would be conducive for them to come and see that they would operate here. And I think Zimbabwe is missing out a lot on outside investment, but not because of sanctions.
Does that then say, from what you're saying, I'm trying to read in between the lines, that so sanctions are not having the desired results. So why do we have them on if the biggest thing is corruption and not sanctions?
Well, clearly sanctions are bugging someone because there's a big campaign, for their removal. So, and they have been, and this I heard from my predecessors, and I've experienced it that a way of us lifting up, pertinent issues such as human rights. Mm. Now, sanctions not having a desired effect. Well, that's a question you should ask from the people and the entities that are on the list. How they feel about it, and if they have encountered any issues about that. We have had, by the way, some legal challenges to the EU restrictive measures because they are a legal instrument, but these challenges have not been successful. And then there's the arms embargo, but that's influencing European exporters. It's not influencing Zimbabwean actors.
So we had the Permanent Secretary for Finance and Economic Development, and he came up with clear negative impact of the sanctions on the financial sector, on banks, the loss of correspondence banks, and the problems that Treasury is having, and the fact that the moment you say there's sanctions over a country, it prejudices that particular country. What's your response to that?
Well, on the financial transaction side, and here I'm venturing into waters that I don't know very well because they are not related to the EU restrictive measures. But I follow this discussion. I've been, indeed, and have heard these claims. Now, there's three words that I would say about that. This is transparency, transparency, transparency. Zimbabwe was recently grey-listed in the Financial Action Task Force listing of countries. That was preceded by a report on Zimbabwe in 2016. And after that, there were, some measures that were expected to be taken or were hoped to be taken in order to improve the financial transactions system and how it works. But these measures didn't bring Zimbabwe all the way, and then the country was listed. Along these there would be outside support coming under the auspices of this system that could help Zimbabwe to move forward on this. And then there's questions about how the financial system works. The role of the central bank, how it's operating. Some murky transactions and deals, and these are having an influence. So I understand why there's issues looking at these points on transparency. And Zimbabwe has been a dollarized economy, and you have been dependent on the dollar. So whatever happens in the dollar world, and Zimbabwe has not been the only country to experience this more tight principles on know your customers and so forth. So I think that has been probably behind some of these stories that we have been hearing.
So Ambassador, there seems to be some light at the end of the tunnel, and I say that because you have had what you call regular formal and informal dialogue with the government of Zimbabwe. Where are those conversations at the present moment? Are you making progress, and where are you making progress?
Yeah, well, like I said, we had the first formal political dialogue with the Zimbabwean government for many, many years now last June. So it was a good start. And it's an important forum from the point of view that the different European member states ambassadors have their own regular contacts with the government. We have our own. But what is important in that setup is that we come together as the EU family to discuss pertinent issues with the government. Foreign ministry is our primary interlocutor, but for example in June we had other line ministries that also present. So I think the first meeting was a very good one as a starting point, where we are a little bit, learning again. Okay, how do we do this? How we work, and it's about building up that trust, and as a group to discuss about pertinent issues, also the difficult issues revolving about governance, democratization, and human rights, so that we put them squarely on the table and exchange views. And then we also, then take notes out of it. And for example, then we had a follow-up system. We are also now going to look at the next round of discussions. Okay, what did we agree upon in the previous rounds, and what's going to happen? And then we are expected to report from our own side, a little bit. Okay, what has been the movement on such and such issues, and the government is coming from there.
Where do you think you made progress?
Like I said, on the trade side, there is progress. On the political front, and partly on the reform agenda side, not as much as we would have hoped for. So this is also an issue that we would also.
But you're talking.
We are talking,
which is a good thing.
It's a good thing, and because closing doors or shouting at each other, is not a solution. You have to keep talking. You have to foster mutual understanding. Where are you coming from? Why are you saying that? Is there, a way of coming closer to each other to understand? So basically, it's a very important forum from that perspective.
When is the next meeting?
I will let government to announce that, because they are the hosts. But
it's not to be a meeting before the end of the year. Is it going to happen?
Yes,
it's going to happen.
It's going to happen before the end of the year.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell me, are you convinced about government's commitment to re-engagement?
We trust the policy that was put forward a year ago and before in the campaigns, and so we really want to see progress happen. Something has been holding progress in a number of areas back. And that's one of the things that we also want to discuss with the government. Okay, what is holding you back? What could be done about it? Like I said, we have been providing financial support to a number of areas, such as constitutional alignment, access to justice, public financial management also. So there has been good policy orientations, promises. The president has had a number of speeches which have been going very strongly against corruption, about countering a culture of fear and intimidation, all of these things which are very positive, but you want to see those also happening.
Concrete on the ground.
Concrete results on the ground.
You also have structured conversations with civil society, and does that, sorry, before I go further, explain to us what the progress of those structured conversations with civil society has been?
Well, with the civil society, we have both financial cooperation. They are our partners in development cooperation. And indeed, we have periodic meetings with them where we discuss about our cooperation, how are they delivering against the targets that have been set. And also we are exchanging about their views about where we are in terms of how the country is moving ahead. And we have heard some concerning news from that front in terms of operating space. And democratization and not restricted to civil society, but also some people that are generally concerned even about their own safety. Mm-hmm. And I think those are quite worrying signs, which are also issues that we definitely want to discuss with the government.
Does these conversations involve the opposition, for instance?
Well, with the opposition, we have our own discussions. Then,
okay.
And that's clear that that's something that diplomatic missions do. I've been attacked personally about engaging with the opposition, but that's clearly something that we have been quite openly discussed also with the government. That obviously that is something that, as diplomatic missions, we involve various stakeholders. So very much we hear the story from the opposition side as well, and that's quite important to have a balanced view of where the country is.
So clearly, from what you've been saying, there's a number of areas that you are unhappy with as far as the government is concerned. Are there areas that you are unhappy with as far as the opposition is concerned?
Well, the government has indeed set up, the primary responsibility, because they have the budget, they have the control of the security forces, they are the ones that are elected and are supposed to deliver. So I would not put the government and opposition in par.
No, you're not. But is there nothing that they've done that deserves your scrutiny?
Well, I've been, we have been very much, not only me but also my colleagues, also encouraged the opposition to have, and the government also to have a constructive approach to the issues that are concerning Zimbabwe. An issues-based orientation on these, and clearly, renounce violence as a way of trying to achieve anything. So these are messages that we are also passing to the opposition.
Is it correct to say the polarization and the toxicity that we see in our politics, the opposition and the government, that the diplomatic community finds itself taking sides in that polarization, which undermines the role or the potential role that you could play as a peacemaker, brokering peace?
I would contest that we take sides.
Please proceed.
People have been accusing us of doing that, but that clearly would be an improper thing for a diplomatic to do. We are supposed to be non-partisan. We are supposed to listen to various parties, and then obviously then report back home what's been happening. And there's a line there about being too pushy and going into internal affairs of the country, which we are very conscious of. So indeed, we are talking to different parties. We are hoping that they would be talking to each other as well. And very much promoting that dialogue to take place in order to foster mutual understanding. But the responses really need to come from the Zimbabweans themselves. They need to decide how the country will move forward and what kind of orientations there will be. Now, in terms of facilitating or peacemaker, the European Union has taken a very conscious approach that there should be African ownership on African issues. So we respect the roles that the regional organizations have. We respect the role that the African Union have, because they have the primary responsibility of making sure that issues don't escalate, that conflicts don't come about. And we want to be supportive in any of those kinds of efforts.
There is in the midst of all that tension, there's a happy story. Zimbabwe has a trade surplus with the EU. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Well, indeed, that's pointing out, the opportunities that there could be in promoting further trade and investments between EU and Zimbabwe. Like you rightly pointed out, there's around $250 million trade surplus for Zimbabwe. The volume of the overall trade is a bit more than $600 million, and in fact, Zimbabwe is exporting more to the European Union than it's importing. I think it's significant because overall, as we know, the trade balance for Zimbabwe is dismal. It's importing a lot and exporting far too little. So this is telling, promising that if one could have the opportunity to expand on that, because the overall percentage of EU only has around 5% of the overall trade with Zimbabwe. So there would be a lot of room to expand on that. And here we are talking especially about the agricultural sector.
Mm. Do you concede the fact that what Zimbabwe needs right now is more trade opportunities, opportunity to export, rather than getting more aid from the EU from anywhere else?
I would completely sign up to the argument that what is needed is trade and investment, and not so much about aid. That's not the. I'm a development cooperation. I've been involved in development cooperation for the past 20 years, but I see the future elsewhere. It's about private sector cooperation. It's about trade. Opportunities are there. There's like for the EU, there's duty and quota-free access to the EU markets. The question is, how much can Zimbabwe make use of those opportunities? We have a 10 million program for supporting the implementation of the free trade agreement. It's looking at, promoting small and medium-sized enterprises, and so within our agricultural support, we are also looking at, how to support export opportunities for Zimbabwe. But there's structural issues that I see that are keeping Zimbabwe behind, and which makes it difficult for it to make full use of that.
I raised that question as a way of us getting into the aid that you're providing, so that we tone down the noise about we're giving so much aid, because aid disables, it doesn't empower. But nonetheless, what's the extent of the aid that the EU is giving to Zimbabwe?
Well, the level of EU aid within this national indicative program that I mentioned is currently around $300 million from 2014 to 2020. But in addition to that, we have then other, that come from our global instruments, regional instruments, which we are, for example, supporting SADC and COMESA, and Zimbabwe is then benefiting from these programs. Our Spotlight initiative on gender-based violence, which is almost $30 million, is one of our global instruments, and that's then for Zimbabwe. So that almost doubles the overall amount of aid. I hear good stories about our projects. I would contest the argument that it disables. I've heard these arguments, Dambisa Moyo and others saying that, the aid is bad for you, it causes corruption, and it takes away responsibility, it makes people more passive. I think what I've seen on the ground on my own visits talk of the opposite. I've seen people that have been empowered by some of our programs, particularly in the agricultural sector. I've seen some very positive stories.
The one project that the team here absolutely love is the EU Film Festival. Oh. How did that go this year?
Fantastic. I have to confess it was my first one, because even last year the edition of 2018 took place before I came into the country. And so we had the film festival running in Bulawayo for a week and then in Harare for a week. And this time around it was bigger and better than ever in its history, because we had additional programs where we reached out to the local filmmaking community. We had master classes where we had, African experts coming to discuss with the local filmmakers about how to enter the movie industry and how to make films, the technical aspects of it. We had input sessions on various themes, a bit on the same line where we're looking at it and reaching out. We had discussions around the European movies that were presented. So all in all, I was very happy how it went, and we had a very good turnout of audience as well.
Have you had an opportunity to visit our tourist destinations?
I have. I have to confess, in my current job, I have a hectic job. I haven't traveled nearly as much as I would have wanted to, but what is good that during my Zambia years, I also visited Zimbabwe and quite a few places. An experience of a lifetime was when I made a canoe trip from Kariba Dam to Kaniemba all the way to the Mozambican border. 10 days. No mobile networks, nothing, just nature. That wasn't the Zimbabwean side, the wilder side of the Zambezi River. It was such a fantastic experience. But also then, the more classical places, Victoria Falls, Matopos. I've been to Gonarejo, Chimanimani, visited Great Zimbabwe. And some people think that Great Zimbabwe is the full story, but it's not. There's Kami ruins, there's several other places. So what is, puts Zimbabwe apart from other destinations? I think mountains, safari destinations, culture and history. Zimbabwe has a variety of places, and destination that makes it very interesting as a tourist destination. I'd love to travel more. I wish I had the time.
We're keeping you busy, hey? What are you currently reading? What book are you reading?
I just finished Simon Sebag Montefiore's biography on Stalin. He has two, one young Stalin and the older Stalin. That's the older Stalin that I finished. And I'm just starting Tom Burgess's book on the looting machine, which is about misusing resources in Africa. I haven't gone very far on that, so I'm just between two books. What I'm usually doing is that I read several books parallel, and which makes me a slow reader. So I have usually a Zimbabwean or African theme, and then another theme like just now on the history of the Soviet Union. What I was afraid a little bit about this question, because when I watched the Brian Nichols story, I was reading exactly those same books where what he mentioned,
right,
with the difference that my book by Bettina Kappa on David Livingstone on the Through Darkness There Comes the Light is signed, and it's the Finnish edition of the book, which I got a
Have you finished reading it?
I'm halfway through. Like I said, I'm reading
a number of books at the same time.
I'm at the Jacob Weinreich part where he's coming with his religious part.
Fascinating book.
Yeah.
What you've just shared with us in terms of you canoeing and so forth does let us into what your hobbies are. And that a couple of times you've said you're stressed, you're working too hard. How do you relax, Ambassador?
I can't say it. It's like, hello, Brussels. I'm not working too hard. I'm working harder, but no. So no. My hobbies, I jog every morning, as you do as well, I think, as walk
yes, I do.
Walk or jog. That's very important for me. I have to get my daily dose of outdoors.
How many kilometers do you do?
Currently around 6, which is not great. I used to run marathons before, but I've grown a bit of weight and so.
With all this hate on social media, do you feel safe running around?
I do feel safe. Okay. In fact, that's one of the highlights of my morning, because people greet me in such a friendly way. It's Mangwanani and Mamukase, and it's a good way to start your work and your daily day. By going.
Anything else that you do to relax?
I'm a history buff, so many of the books that I read are history. So I do read a lot of history, and then I do love nature and safaris, and I wished I had more time for that in Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe is the right place for
Indeed.
nature and safaris. I hope, Ambassador, you do have the time to do more nature and safaris. We're grateful for you finding the time to come onto In Conversation with Trevor, and we hope we have another opportunity that will be much more full of good news than what we've been able to share right now. Thank you so much for coming. And for you at home, in Zimbabwe, in the diaspora, all across the African continent, we thank you for watching the show. Remember, In Conversation with Trevor is a weekly show. For you not to miss out, we suggest that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are also available on Twitter, in Convo with Trevor. We're available on Facebook. You'll get notifications when you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss out on these amazing conversations. Thank you for watching. See you next time.